Welcome to Lectures by Lobezi. I'm your host, Dr. Lobezi. Today I'm going to be reading Unit 7.1, The Industrial Revolution. Quickly go through the learning objectives. Analyze how life changed in the Industrial Revolution. Identify key innovations during the Agricultural Revolution and how they spurred industrialization. Explain why the Industrial Revolution took place in Great Britain, outline the new technologies that helped trigger the Industrial Revolution, describe the key innovations that transformed the textile industry, identify the improvements in transportation, explain what caused urbanization and what life was like in the new industrial cities, compare and contrast the industrial working class and the new middle class, and then finally analyze the many challenges associated with industrialization. Number 1, the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is the era of increased manufacture of machine-made goods beginning in England in the mid-1750s. Since that's a vocab term, I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. All right, move on. Let's see, try that again. I think I got it now. Okay, and then also down here it says machines began doing the jobs that either people did by hand or used animals for. I'm going to go ahead and highlight this as well. It says the Industrial Revolution began in England but spread to continental Europe and North America by the mid-1800s. I think it's important to note that it began in England, so I'm going to go ahead and highlight that as well. It is a process of economic change from an agricultural to a modern industrial society. All right. So at first, Europe was an agrarian economy, but by 1914, most of Europe had become industrialized. Merchants went from selling their goods in local or regional markets to selling them in a world economy. It led to Europe's global primacy or control of the world. 3 historical events led to the Industrial Revolution. The Age of Discovery and Exploration led European nations to establish colonial economies based on the concept of mercantilism. The Scientific Revolution produced the first wave of mechanical inventions. And then the Agricultural Revolution caused Europe's population to grow dramatically. 2. The Open Field System. The open field system was a system of agriculture that existed in Europe during the Middle Ages, where land in a village was divided into large fields and cultivated cooperatively by the peasants. Again, since that's a ID term and that appears to be a definition, I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. Each field was cut up into long, narrow strips, with each family owning a few of their own. The fields were open, and the strips were not enclosed in plots by fences. I think this looks like a good part of an additional part of the definition, as we're, well, now we'll go ahead and omit that. All right, so the ever-present problem at this time was exhaustion of the soil. Planting wheat year after year caused the nitrogen to be depleted, causing crop failure. Since the supply of manure for fertilizer was limited, a field had to lie fallow in order to recover. During the Middle Ages, a system of crop rotation known as the 3-field system developed, where wheat rye was planted one year, followed by a year of oats or beans, and then a year of fallow. Farming villages maintained 3 large fields where at any one time 2 fields were growing crops, and the fallow field was used as pasture land for the livestock. Okay, so what I'm going to do is fallow field was used as pasture land for the livestock. That seems to be a bit of a definition there, so we'll go ahead and highlight that. So fallow just means allowing the field to rest. Nothing was done to it. Villagers also maintained open meadows for hay and natural pasture called common lands, set aside for the village animals. After the harvest, women of the village would go through the fields, picking up the few single grains that had fallen to the ground, a process known as gleaning. I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. Even though it's not an ID term, it is one in which it's underlined, so it's still important. So after the field, I'm just going to go ahead and highlight all of that right there. Okay? It says heavy taxes and high rents instituted by monarchs and the nobility meant peasants were left with little food to survive. In winter, villagers often had to slaughter their pigs, sheep, geese, and chickens rather than try to feed them until the next year's grain could be harvested, meaning herds always remained small. In the spring, villagers worked together to plowing the fields with oxen or horses and planting the seeds. Crows, mice, and rats were constant pests. To make matters worse, villagers were not allowed to hunt the deer or rabbits that ate the crops. The Lord reserved this pastime for himself and his family, and villagers were harshly punished for poaching the Lord's game. In the fall, again, the villagers would work together harvesting their crops, with the men using a curved blade called a sickle, or a longer curved blade mounted on a large handle called a sickle. Well, actually, that's a typo. That should be a scythe. To cut down the stalks. Then the farmers bundled the stalks, take them to the barns, and thresh or beat them to separate the grain from the chaff. Crop failures occurred at least once every 10 years due to drought or heavy rains. Famine was often the result of crop failures, as starvation and disease could claim a third of a villager's population. The solution to the inadequate supply of food lay in finding a way to cultivate more land so more food could be produced. 3. Agricultural Revolution. The Agricultural Revolution was a period of advancement in food production in England in the early 1700s that boosted crop yields and populations. I think you know what I'm going to say here because this is an ID term, so we're going to need to highlight that because that appears to be a definition. They borrowed many ideas from the Dutch, who in the Netherlands had devised better ways to build dikes and to drain land so that they could farm more land. The Dutch also experimented with new crops such as clover and turnips that restored nitrogen to the soil. English landowners improved upon these ideas with three major developments: the four-field rotation system, the seed drill, and selective breeding techniques for livestock. The effects of the agricultural revolution were many. With declining infant mortality rates and fewer people dying of disease, Europe's population shot up from roughly 120 to 180 million from 17 to 1800. Improved hygiene, sanitation, and quarantining efforts reduced the deadly nature of disease, and the last outbreak of bubonic plague struck Marseille, France in 1721. This led food prices to begin to fall, meaning families could afford to buy other consumer goods. New technology meant fewer farm hands were required, so many rural families moved to cities in search of work. The four-field rotation system. A system of growing different crops in a field each year to preserve the land's fertility is known as the four-field system. So let's go ahead and highlight all of that again, because that's an underlying term, so still important. It was developed in the 1730s by an English lord, Charles Turnip Townshend, by rotating wheat, barley, clover, and turnips in his fields to boost production. Well, I'm going to go ahead and highlight this part here. Developed in the 1730s by the English lord, and then by rotating wheat, barley, clover, and turnips on his field to boost production. Wheat and barley were the money-producing crops, whereas clover and turnips restored nitrogen to the soil, which helped prevent soil exhaustion. Since clover and turnips were used as fodder or food, farmers no longer had to slaughter their livestock in the winter. This led the livestock population to grow, and as a result, more meat for better diets, more manure for fertilizer, and more grain for bread and porridge. The seed drill. A 1701 invention by Jethro Tull. The seed drill allowed farmers to sow seeds in well-spaced rows at specific depths. All right. I think the year is important. We'll go ahead and again do the front and then the back of the ID term for the definition. Older methods of planting included broadcasting, where the farmhand would follow the plow, throwing handfuls of seed across the field with only a portion of the seeds would germinate, which made the whole system inefficient. A plow in front of the seed drill created the rows for the seeds, and a harrow at the back covered the seed with soil. The seeds would pass from a hopper above to a funnel below so that they could be directed into the row. All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and highlight these two because they do seem to supplement the definition. It was the first agricultural machine with moving parts. It started as a one-man, one-row device, but later designs sowed seeds in 3 uniform rows and had wheels. The seed drill led to a larger share of seeds to germinate, which boosted crop yields. Tull also invented a mechanical horse-drawn hoe that dug up the soil, loosening it for planting while also pulling up unwanted weed roots. He believed that you should till the soil after the plant is growing to reduce the amount of weeds growing around it. Other agricultural inventions, such as the iron plow, then the steel plow, and the reaper, improved efficiency as well. Number 4, livestock breeding. Robert Bakewell was a livestock expert who introduced selective breeding techniques known as animal husbandry to improve the quality and size of livestock. Go ahead and highlight that. Previously, most cattle and sheep were slaughtered before winter. Since there was no food to feed them, and they provided meat during the cold, but harvesting turnips meant that livestock could now be fed during the winter, increasing the number of animals. He experimented with both sheep and cattle by allowing only the best to reproduce, causing their sizes to double over time. Livestock could now be sold for their meat value, not just their hair, wool, milk, or ability to work on a farm. Number 5, the enclosure movement. Many of the agricultural innovations didn't work well with the existing system of cultivation taking place in village communities. Again, each farmer tilled an assortment of unconnected strips of land, with large portions of land remaining fallow and animals grazing on another section of uncultivated land called the commons. By the 1750s, the rising price of wheat encouraged landlords to enclose their land with fences or hedges to achieve greater profits, a process that threatened to drive smaller landowners off the land, resulting in a number of peasant uprisings. Also, when animal breeding became successful, many landowners wanted to enclose their land to prevent breeding with lesser animals or to prevent the spread of disease. Since the larger landowners were the only ones who could afford the new technology, they began buying out or pushing the smaller landowners off the land so that they can enclose larger swaths of land. The old common rights of the villagers were part of the common law in England, and only an act of Parliament could change them. So the great landowners who controlled Parliament passed the Enclosure Act of 1801, authorizing the enclosure by fences, walls, or hedges of the old common lands. Okay, so we're going to back up here, highlight this, and then highlight the rest of this. Okay. Those who refused enclosure due to the expenses were fined, allowing wealthy landowners to buy their strips of land at auction. I'm going to highlight that too, because it seems to supplement the definition. Okay. The Enclosure Act is controversial because although they led to continued farming innovations and increased food production, they disrupted traditional communities by forcing independent farmers off their land. For some landless peasants, they became wage earners, working as farmhands for their new landlords. Still, others moved to the cities in search of work, while others emigrated to Canada, Australia, and the United States. Number 6, the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain. The innovations of the agricultural revolution led to an increased food supply and lower prices, creating a demand for additional consumer goods, which served as a reason why Great Britain industrialized first. The growing food supply also led Great Britain's population to grow from 5.5 million in 1700 to over 9 million in 1800. The population growth created even more demand for consumer goods. Furthermore, Britain had the advantage of plentiful natural resources, natural ports, and navigable rivers. Rivers supplied water power and allowed for the construction of canals, which aided commerce as more goods could be bought and sold. Britain's plentiful supply of coal and iron was fundamental to its industrialization because it was used to power steam engines and to build new machines. No place in Britain was more than 70 miles from the sea, so manufacturers had an easy time shipping goods overseas. From the mid-1600s to 1700s, trade from its growing overseas empire helped the British economy grow and prosper. In addition to its natural resources, Britain had an expanding economy to support industrialization. Entrepreneurs were willing to risk their capital in the manufacture of new inventions. Britain's highly developed banking system also contributed to the country's industrialization. People were encouraged by the availability of bank loans to invest in new machinery to expand their operations. Finally, Great Britain had a stable government that supported economic growth. While other countries in Europe faced internal tariffs that were an obstacle to business, Great Britain did not. The government placed few regulations on businesses, which encouraged people to start their own. Textiles industry, first industry. Major inventions in the textile industry: wools, linens, and cotton. Cottage industry, a system of rural manufacturing where work is subcontracted out to be completed in people's homes with hand tools or simple machines. Okay, this appears to be a definition, so we're going to go ahead and highlight that right there. During the Middle Ages, manufacturing was controlled by urban craft guilds and merchants. However, the enclosure movement led to an abundance of landless peasants looking for work. Merchants began to use the pool of labor in the countryside to manufacture various goods over the more costly guilds. By the end of the 18th century, this type of manufacturing led to the collapse of the urban craft guilds. The same peasants who tilled the land in spring and summer often spun thread or wove textiles in the winter. Under what is also called the putting out system, urban textile merchants took wool or flax to the homes of peasants who spun it into thread. All right, because that is an underlined term, we're going to go ahead and highlight everything around that as well. The merchant then transported the thread to other peasants who wove it into cloth. Okay, so this is a two-step process, not just spinning, but also weaving. This type of work proved to be beneficial to the peasant family. The task could be divided up among many family members, and the work could be done whenever there was time to do so. By the mid-1700s, demand for cotton textiles was growing more rapidly than production in Britain, which had a large domestic and North American market for their goods. Had manufacturing still been controlled by the craft guilds, they would not have allowed new inventions to be used that increased the rate of production. Inventors devised some of the most famous machines to meet consumer demand for cotton textiles. For example, John Kay invented a simple hand-powered machine in 1733 called the flying shuttle, which enabled weavers to work so fast that they soon outpaced spinners. All right, so we'll go ahead and highlight that. In 1764, James Hargreaves solved the problem through his invention of the spinning jenny, which spun many threads at the same time. All right, underlined, so we'll highlight that. A few years later, in 1769, Richard Arkwright patented the water frame, which was a spinning machine that could be powered by water. All right, highlight that. This invention doomed the cottage industry because the machines were too large and expensive to be operated in homes. Okay, let's highlight the machines were too large and expensive to be operated in homes. Instead, manufacturers built long sheds to house the machines. These sheds became the first factories. Okay, I'm going to back up here. I'm going to say manufacturers built long sheds to house the machines. And then sheds became the first factories. Okay, and initially they were located near rapidly moving streams, harnessing the water power to run the machines. The invention of the Power Loom in the 1780s by Edmund Cartwright sped up the process of weaving again by making the process mechanized, and cotton output increased by 800% between 1780 and 1800. All right. Okay, we'll do that. Meanwhile, in America, these faster spinning and weaving machines presented a challenge: how to produce enough raw cotton to keep up with the English demand. Raw cotton grown in the South had to be cleaned of dirt and seeds by hand, a time-consuming task. To solve this, Eli Whitney, while acting as a tutor on a plantation in Georgia in 1793, invented the cotton gin, which separated the seeds from the raw cotton at a fast rate. All right, so we'll go ahead and include the date of the invention along with the invention. Whitney's invention was quickly adopted, and the rate of cotton production increased exponentially. I'm going to add that to the definition because that is important. This led the decaying plantation economy to be revived, as well as the importance of slavery to its economy. Number 8, turnpikes and canals. As cotton manufacturing increased, entrepreneurs needed faster and cheaper methods of moving goods from place to place. Some capitalists invented turnpikes, private roads built by entrepreneurs who charged travelers a toll or fee to use them. Okay, highlight that. Says goods traveled faster as a result, and turnpikes soon linked every part of Britain. Go ahead and highlight that as well. Other entrepreneurs had canals dug to connect rivers together or to connect inland towns with coastal ports. Engineers also built stronger bridges and upgraded harbors to help the expanding overseas trade. Starting in the late 1700s, factories needed an efficient, inexpensive way to receive coal and raw materials and then to ship finished goods to market. In 1763, when the Bridgewater Canal opened, it not only made a profit from tolls, but it cut in half the price of coal in Manchester. The success of this canal set off a canal building frenzy. Entrepreneurs formed companies to construct canals for profit. Not all the canals that were built had enough traffic to support them, however, and bankruptcy often resulted. Then, beginning in the 1830s, canals were surpassed in importance by the steam locomotive that made railroads the new preferred form of transportation. Number 9, steam engine. At the start of the 1700s, a wood shortage in Europe led people to turn to coal as a fuel source. Deep coal mines could not be dug until a method for pumping out water could be devised. In 1712, British inventor Thomas Newcomen built the first steam engine to pump water out of mines, but it was an inefficient design, meaning it consumed so much fuel that it could only be used where a plentiful supply of coal existed. So we'll include this, all of this. Okay. And I'm going to also add that it was an inefficient design. Okay. Scottish engineer James Watt looked at Newcomen's invention in 1764 and set out to make improvement on the engine in order to make it more efficient. Okay, so we're going to add that. Watt lacked the money to produce and market it, so he formed a business partnership with Matthew Boulton, a toy button and shoe buckle manufacturer. Okay, so we'll include that and all of that. Whoop. And that W there. All right. Together they founded Soho Engineering Works in Birmingham, England, to manufacture steam engines. All right. I'm going to add that because that's related to both of them. All right. Eventually, a measure of mechanical and electrical powers known as the watt would be named for James Watt. Once the steam engine caught on, it became the prime mover of the Industrial Revolution, from factories to ships, and finally, locomotives. More importantly, his invention meant factories no longer had to rely upon the unreliable power of streams and rivers, and could therefore be located closer to cities, which was where the labor supply was located. Number 10, steam locomotives and railroads. It was the invention of the steam locomotive that made the growth of railroads possible. In 1821, English engineer George Stephenson built a steam-powered locomotive to pull carriages along iron rails, which he named the Rocket because it could reach speeds of 36 miles per hour when not carrying a load. Okay, so we'll highlight that, and then all of this, all the way down to the name Rocket. Okay. He built a 27-mile railroad that led from coal fields in the city of Yorkshire to the port of Stockton on the North Sea, and it used 4 locomotives that Stephenson had designed and built. News of this success quickly spread throughout Britain, and soon entrepreneurs were developing plans for a railroad line to connect the port of Liverpool with the inland city of Manchester. In 1830, the Liverpool-Manchester line opened, and the Rocket hauled a 13-ton load at speeds greater than 24 miles per hour. I'm just gonna tag that because that's related to George Stephenson and the locomotive. Okay, since railroads did not have to follow the course of a river, tracks could go places where rivers did not, allowing factory owners and merchants to ship goods swiftly and cheaply over land. In the following decades, railroad travel became faster and railroad building boomed, creating thousands of new jobs for railroad workers and miners. Thousands of railroad workers prepared the ground for tracks, laid the tracks, and constructed railroad stations. Because iron was needed for the locomotive and the tracks, it became every bit as important as coal. By 1870, rail lines crisscrossed Britain, Europe, and the United States. By 1903, Russians had built the Trans-Siberian Railroad to the Pacific Ocean. Trolleys and subways were introduced, and later suburban rail lines made the daily commute a part of modern life. All right, number 11, urbanization. The Industrial Revolution brought rapid urbanization, or the movement of people to the cities. Highlight that. Changes in farming, soaring population growth, and an ever-increasing demand for workers led masses of people to migrate from farms to cities. Although that's not part of the definition, that's an important cause, so we'll go ahead and tag that. Almost overnight, small towns around coal or iron mines mushroomed into cities. Other cities grew up around the factories that entrepreneurs built in once quiet market towns. The British market town of Manchester numbered 17,000 people in the 1750s. Within a few years, it exploded into a center of textile industry. Its population soared to 40,000 by 1780 and 70,000 by 1801. Visitors described the cloud of coal vapor that polluted the air, the pounding noise of steam engines, and the filthy stench of its river. This growth of industry and rapid population growth dramatically changed the location and distribution of two resources, labor and people. London became Europe's largest city with a population of 1 million by 1800. The growing number of inhabitants outpaced the ability of cities to build enough housing. Therefore, cities were quickly built without sanitation and building codes, meaning streets had no pavement, drains, or garbage collection. Slums with indescribable filth grew, and diseases, especially cholera, ravaged the population. Concerns over health and housing rose as a result of the great cholera epidemic of the 1830s and 1840s. Unlike many other common deadly diseases of the day that touched only the poor, cholera struck all classes. Number 12. New social classes emerge. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, only two social classes existed in Europe. The upper class was comprised of the nobility, who were very wealthy due to the amount of land they possessed. They were known as the leisure class, meaning they did not work. The peasantry was the other class, and this included small rural landowners who were often very poor. There were a small number of larger non-noble landowners and wealthier merchants, artisans, and businessmen, but their numbers were too small to inhabit a separate social class. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, two new social classes emerged, the middle class and the working class. There were two tiers within the middle class. Therefore, the upper middle class was made up of those who owned and operated the new factories, mines, and railroads, among other industries. The wealth of these new industry owners, merchants, and investment bankers was often the equal to or greater than that of aristocrats. However, the aristocracy looked down on those who had made their fortunes in the vulgar business world. Not until the late 1800s were the upper middle class seen as social equals to the lords of the countryside. The second tier is simply referred to as the middle class, and its growing numbers were comprised of doctors, lawyers, governmental bureaucrats, and managers of factories, mines, and shops. All members of the middle class lived comfortable lives in the outskirts of industrial towns, in what is now called the suburbs. They wore fancy clothing, ate well, and had large, lavishly decorated homes situated on paved roads with running water. They spent their leisure time attending the theater, ballets, opera, museums, or hosting or attending dinner parties. The middle class is nicknamed the servant-keeping class, as all members had at least one servant, and the upper middle class having 10 or more. Prior to the 1800s, middle-class parents selected their children's spouses. At the start of the 19th century, young people were allowed to marry for love, companionate marriage. However, their parents still played an active role in helping them select appropriate mates. Middle-class girls were expected to remain virgins until they married, and if they didn't, their marriage prospects would quickly disappear. To ensure this, parents made sure that a chaperone always accompanied the young couple on dates until at least they were engaged. Once married, the wife could oversee the day-to-day runnings of the house, supervise the servants, keep the couple's social calendar, and of course, raise the children. There was a degree of class consciousness, in that they were aware of their social standing, which led them to emulate the lifestyle of the upper class as much as they could afford. Okay, so class consciousness is emulating the class or the lifestyle of the class just above you. So if you were middle, you would emulate the upper middle. The upper middle would emulate the upper class. All right. Some middle class people rose from rags to riches, a pattern that the age greatly admired. Since they worked hard to get where they were, they saw poverty as a moral failing due to laziness or drunkenness. They primarily donated money to charities that devoted their efforts to children who they held blameless for their poverty. The working class was also made up of two tiers as well. The lower rung was primarily occupied by servants and factory workers. Because their wages were low, the women often worked as well. Their homes were typically in the center of town in what were classified as the slums. Oftentimes they were packed into tiny rooms in tenements or multi-story buildings divided into apartments. All right, let's go ahead and highlight that. All right. These tenements had no running water, only community pumps. All right. Had no running water, only community pumps. Since there was no sanitation, people disposed of their trash on the many dung heaps in the middle of neighborhoods. The lack of indoor plumbing meant that in the slums, people were forced to relieve themselves in privies that often overflowed with waste, only to be emptied and dumped into canals or rivers. The sewage contaminated the drinking water, which contributed to the cholera epidemic mentioned above. The upper working class, or labor aristocracy, as they were known, were comprised of skilled artisans. These workers received good pay, which in some cases rivaled those of the lower middle classes. In many cases, women could afford to remain at home to care for the children. They lived in modest-sized homes outside of the slums, but they were still smaller than middle-class homes. Although they valued hard work like the middle class, they took pride in the fact that they worked with their hands for a living. Number 13, workers find comfort in religion. Okay, let's scroll down. Ooh, sorry about that. Okay, many working class people found comfort in Methodism, a new religion established by John Wesley. All right, so let's do that. Actually, let's add that to the definition of Methodism. Who, as an Anglican minister, desired a faith where he could have a stronger emotional connection with God. All right. Let's add that. Anglican minister desired a faith where he could have a stronger emotional connection with God. So we'll assume that Methodism has something to do with that. Strong emotional connection with God. All right. Because of growing needs of the growing urban population in England, Wesley found many converts. Also, due to the influence of the Enlightenment and deism, the Anglican Church had grown detached from its followers. To remedy this, from 1759 to 1790, Wesley traveled some 225,000 miles preaching more than 40,000 sermons to the people. Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty, I'm going to add the date too. That's a pretty significant undertaking and accomplishment. So we're going to go ahead and highlight that. All right. He emphasized not only was salvation open to all who desired it, but a rewarding and heartfelt devotion to God was possible. However, he challenged people to seek forgiveness for their sins and to live godly lives devoted to good deeds towards others. Although his charismatic and emotionally charged sermons attracted many followers, his critics ridiculed Methodism as superstitious nonsense. They set up Sunday schools where followers not only study the Bible but also learn to read and write. Methodists helped channel workers' anger away from revolution and toward reform. All right, let me just look here quickly. I think I'm gonna add two things here to highlight two things. He challenged people to seek forgiveness for their sins and to live godly lives. All right, devoted to good deeds towards others. And then we'll say critics also ridiculed Methodism as superstitious nonsense. Okay. Early industrial working conditions, number 14. Working in a factory system differed greatly from working on a farm. In rural villages, people worked hard, but their work varied according to the season. They also had little use for time, as they had tremendous flexibility in when they tended to their work. Life was also hard for poor rural workers who were part of the putting out system, but at least they worked at their own pace and usually with their family members nearby. When farm families moved to the new industrial cities, they became workers in mines or factories. Many felt lost and bewildered as they faced tough working conditions in fast-paced, uncomfortable environments. The concept of time took on a whole new meaning as workers faced a rigid schedule set by the factory whistle. Working hours were long, with shifts lasting from 12 to 16 hours, 6 or 7 hours a day. Workers could only take breaks when the factory owners gave permission. Exhausted workers suffered accidents from machines that had no safety devices. They might lose a finger, a limb, or even their lives. In textile mills, workers constantly breathed in air filled with lint, which damaged their lungs. Those workers who became sick or injured lost their jobs. The majority of early factory workers were women rather than men. Employers often preferred to hire women because they thought women could adapt more easily to machines and were easier to manage. In addition, employers generally paid women half what they paid men. Factory work created a double burden for women because their new jobs took them out of their homes for 12 hours or more a day before they could return to care for their children. The Industrial Revolution increased the demand for iron and coal, which in turn increased the need for miners. Although miners were paid more, working conditions in the mines were even worse than in the factories. They worked in darkness, and the coal dust destroyed their lungs. There were always the dangers of explosions, flooding, and collapsing tunnels. Women and children carted heavy loads of coal, sometimes on all fours in low passages. They also climbed ladders carrying heavy baskets of coal several times a day. Factories and mines also hired many boys and girls. These children often started working at age 7 or 8, a few as young as 5. Nimble-fingered and quick-moving, they changed spools in the hot and humid textile mills when sometimes they could not see because of all the dust. They also crawled under machinery to repair broken threads in the mills. Conditions were even worse for children who worked in the mines. Some sat all day in the dark, opening and closing air vents, while others hauled coal carts in the extreme heat. Because children had helped with work on the farm, parents accepted the idea of child labor. The wages the children earned were needed to keep their families from starving. In the 1830s, workers became concerned about the plight of child laborers because parents were more often separated from their own children in the factories. The Sadler Commission, held by Parliament in 1832, chaired by Michael Sadler, investigated the situation of children employed in British factories and helped initiate legislation to improve overall working conditions in factories. I'm going to go ahead and highlight all of that. Okay. Scroll down. Oh, we're at the finish. Okay, so the English Factory Act of 1833 forbade the employment of children under age 9, limited the workday of children aged 9 to 13 to 9 hours a day, and required the factory owner to pay for 2 hours of education a day for these children. So we're going to highlight all of that for the definition. Almost always, the women in the factories were young single women or widows who, upon marriage, usually found their husbands earn enough money for them to leave the factory. After passage of the English Factory Act, many workers demanded shorter work days for adults to allow them to spend more time with their children. In 1847, Parliament passed the 10 Hours Act, which mandated a 10-hour workday, allowing parents and children more hours together as a domestic unit. All right, so we'll go ahead and stop here. All right, so before I pause the video or stop the video at like 44 minutes, I want to recommend that when you replay it, if you can, replay it at a higher speed, 1.25 or even 1.5. That'll shorten the amount of time it's going to take to go through this reading. Hope this helps. Check for a new video coming soon.